An unexpected visitor, Jake Hansen sighed as he settled into his small, cramped apartment on the interstellar colony of New Eden. As a maintenance technician, his job was to keep the station running smoothly, fixing malfunctioning air filters, repairing faulty gravity plating, that sort of thing. It wasn't glamorous work, but it paid the bills. Little did Jake know, his quiet, routine existence was about to get a lot more interesting. It started when a strange, crystalline ship docked at New Eden, disgorging a single, strange alien passenger. She was humanoid, but taller and more slender, with iridescent lavender skin, 4 arms, and large silver eyes. As the closest thing New Eden had to a welcoming committee, Jake was dispatched to greet her. "Welcome to New Eden," Jake said awkwardly, extending a hand in what he hoped was a universal gesture of greeting. "I'm Jake, the station technician, and you are?" "I am called Xyloth," the alien replied in perfect, unaccented English. Her voice was musical, almost hypnotic. "I have traveled a great distance to be here, in search of a mate." Jake blinked, sure he must have misheard. "I'm sorry, did you say a mate?" As in a partner to breed with?" "Yes," Xyloth confirmed matter-of-factly. "My species, Sci-Fi, only enter our mating cycle once every 100 years. When we do, we must find a suitable partner or face extinction." Jake swallowed hard, his mind racing. An alien on New Eden, looking for a mate? This was definitely above his pay grade. "Well, I'm not sure how much I can help with that," he stammered. "New Eden is a small colony, mostly human. I don't think we have any Sci-Fi here." Xyloth smiled, a strange, alien expression that made Jake's skin crawl. "Oh, I am not looking for another Sci-Fi," she purred. "I am looking for a human mate, and I believe I have found him." She took a step closer to Jake, her 4 arms reaching for him. Jake stumbled back, his heart pounding. What had he gotten himself into? Little did Jake realize, this was only the beginning. Xyloth's arrival would trigger a chain of events that would test his ingenuity, his courage, and his very understanding of what it means to be human. For when an alien comes to mate, nothing on New Eden will ever be the same again. The mating ritual begins. Jake stared at Xyloth in disbelief, his mind reeling. An alien here to find a human mate. It was like something out of a bad science fiction movie. "Hold on," he said, holding up his hands. "I think there's been some kind of misunderstanding. Humans and Sci-Fi, we're not compatible. Biologically, I mean, it wouldn't work." Xyloth tilted her head, her silver eyes unblinking. "You are mistaken, Jake Hansen," she said. "Sci-Fi biology is highly adaptable. We can mate with any species, given the right stimulation." She took another step toward him, her iridescent skin starting to glow softly. A strange, spicy scent filled the air, making Jake's head swim. "Whoa, okay, hold on," he said, backing away. "I'm flattered, really, but I'm not interested in being your mate. I'm sure there are other humans who might be more willing." Xyloth's expression turned cold, her 4 arms crossing over her chest. "You do not understand," she said. "I have chosen you, Jake Hansen. The mating ritual has already begun. There can be no other." Jake's heart sank as he realized the magnitude of the situation he was in. A quick glance around confirmed his worst fears. Xyloth had sealed the door to his apartment, trapping him inside with her. "Listen, Xyloth," he said, trying to keep his voice calm. "On Earth, we have a saying, no means no. I'm saying no. I don't want to be your mate." Xyloth hissed, a low, menacing sound that made the hair on the back of Jake's neck stand up. "You have no choice, human," she snarled. "The mating must be completed, or my species will perish. You will submit, or you will suffer." She began to advance on him, her skin pulsing with hypnotic patterns of light. Jake scrambled back, his mind racing. He was trapped, alone, with an increasingly aggressive alien dead set on mating with him. He had to find a way out of this, and fast. But as Xyloth's strange pheromones filled the air, Jake felt his resolve beginning to weaken. His thoughts grew fuzzy, his limbs heavy. Some primitive part of his brain was responding to Zoloth's alien allure, even as his rational mind screamed in protest. Jake shook his head, fighting the biochemical onslaught. He was human, damn it, not some mindless breeding machine. He would find a way to reason with Zoloth, to make her understand. He just hoped he could do it before her mating instincts completely consumed them both. Caught in the middle, Jake and Zoloth circled each other warily, the air thick with tension and alien pheromones. Jake's mind raced as he tried to find a way to defuse the situation, to make Zoloth see reason. "Zoloth, please," he said, keeping his voice low and even. "I understand your species is facing a crisis. But forcing yourself on an unwilling partner isn't the answer. There has to be another way." Zoloth's silver eyes flashed with anger and desperation. "There is no other way," she hissed. "I have searched across 100 star systems, evaluated countless potential mates. You are the most compatible, the most viable. Without you, the Zephyr will perish." She lunged for him, her forearms outstretched. Jake dodged, barely avoiding her grasp. He couldn't keep this up forever. Sooner or later, Zoloth's superior strength and speed would overwhelm him. He needed a plan, and fast. Suddenly, a loud boom echoed through the apartment, shaking the walls. Zoloth froze, her head snapping towards the sound. "No," she whispered, her voice filled with dread. "It cannot be." The door to Jake's apartment blew inward, ripped off its hinges by an incredible force. Through the smoking rubble strode 3 more Sci-Fi, their iridescent skin glowing with menacing light. "Zoloth," the lead Zephyr roared, his deep voice filled with rage. "You dare to claim a mate without facing us in the ritual combat. You dishonor yourself and our species." Zoloth hissed, moving to put herself between Jake and the intruders. "Zorax," she spat, "I should have known you would follow me. You could never accept that I am the superior mate." Zorax snarled, his forearms flexing with barely contained violence. "It is you who are inferior, Zoloth," he growled. "You fled the mating grounds like a coward, seeking to steal a mate rather than win one honorably. But no matter. We will settle this here, now, in the ancient way." He turned his burning gaze on Jake, who felt a chill run down his spine. "As for you, human," Zorax rumbled, "you have been caught in the middle of a Zephyr mating ritual. By our laws, you must choose a champion to fight for your bond. Choose wisely, for the loser will forfeit their life." Jake swallowed hard, his mind reeling. Choose a champion? Forfeit their life? This was insane. He was just a maintenance technician, not some kind of alien mating prize. But as he looked from Zoloth to Zorax and his companions, Jake realized he had no choice. Like it or not, he was part of this now. And if he wanted to survive, he would have to play by the Zephyr's rules. Steeling himself, Jake stepped forward, meeting Zorax's gaze unflinchingly. "I choose," he began, his voice shaking only slightly. But before he could finish, all hell broke loose. Zoloth let out a screech of fury and launched herself at Zorax, her forearms a blur of deadly motion. Zorax rolled in response, meeting her attack with his own. The other 2 Zephyr moved to join the fray, that alien battle cries echoing off the walls. Jake dove for cover as the apartment became a war zone, alien combatants smashing furniture and hurling energy blasts with wild abandon. He huddled behind the ruined remains of his couch, his heart pounding in his ears. What had he gotten himself into? And more importantly, how the hell was he going to get out of it alive? As the battle raged around him, Jake knew one thing for certain: his days of being just a simple maintenance technician were over. Like it or not, he was in the middle of an alien mating ritual now. And one way or another, he was going to have to see it through to the end. A daring plan. Jake huddled behind the ruins of his couch, his mind racing as the alien battle raged around him. Zoloth and Zorax were locked in vicious combat, their iridescent forms a blur of deadly motion. The other 2 Zephyr darted in and out, delivering glancing blows and energy blasts when they could. Jake knew he couldn't stay hidden forever. Sooner or later, the fight would end, and the victor would come for him, expecting him to honor the outcome of their ritual combat. But Jake had no intention of becoming the mate of any of these crazed, violent aliens, no matter who won. He needed a plan, a way to turn the tables and get out of this insane situation. And as he watched the battle unfold, an idea began to take shape in his mind. The Sci-Fi were formidable fighters, but they were driven by instinct and ritual. They fought with a kind of blind ferocity, heedless of their surroundings or collateral damage. That single-mindedness could be exploited if one was clever and daring enough. Jake's gaze fell on the station's emergency environmental controls, housed in a reinforced panel on the far wall. If he could get to those controls, he might be able to alter the atmosphere in his apartment, flooding it with a gas that would incapacitate the Sci-Fi without harming him. It was a desperate gamble, but it was the only chance he had. Taking a deep breath, Jake waited for a lull in the fighting. When it came, he sprang from his hiding place and sprinted for the control panel, ducking and weaving to avoid the flailing limbs and energy blasts of the battling aliens. He was almost there when Zorax spotted him. With a roar of rage, the massive Sci-Fi broke away from his duel with Ziloth and lunged for Jake, his forearms reaching to crush the human's fragile body. Jake didn't hesitate. With a burst of desperate speed, he leaped forward, his fingers slamming down on the emergency controls just as Zorax's hands closed around his throat. There was a hiss of releasing gas, and a sudden, eerie silence fell over the apartment. The Sci-Fi, caught mid-battle, wavered and collapsed, their iridescent forms sprawling motionless on the floor. Jake staggered back from the control panel, coughing and gasping for air. He'd done it. His crazy plan had actually worked. But as the adrenaline began to fade, a new worry crept into Jake's mind. The environmental controls had been a last resort, never intended for use in a confined space like his apartment. He had no idea what kind of effect the gas might have on the station's life support systems, or on the other residents of New Eden. He had to get help, to warn the colony of the potential danger. But first, he had to make sure the Sci-Fi were truly incapacitated, and not just playing possum. Cautiously, Jake approached Ziloth's still form, half expecting her to leap up and attack at any moment. But she remained motionless, her silver eyes closed, her chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. A sudden pang of guilt stabbed through Jake's chest. Ziloth's methods may have been misguided, even abhorrent, but at the heart of it, she'd just been trying to save her species from extinction. Did she really deserve this fate, gassed into submission on the floor of an alien apartment? Jake shook his head, pushing the thought aside. He couldn't afford to second-guess himself now. He'd done what he had to do to survive. The rest would have to wait. Stepping carefully over the unconscious bodies of the Sci-Fi, Jake made his way to the ruined door of his apartment. He had to find the colony's security forces to explain what had happened and coordinate a response to the potential environmental threat. But as he stepped out into the corridor, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from over. The Sci-Fi had proven themselves to be a tenacious and unpredictable species. Somehow, he doubted a little knockout gas would be enough to deter them from their mating mission forever. No, Jake had a sinking suspicion that his troubles with the Sci-Fi were only just beginning. And if he wanted to protect himself and the colony he called home, he was going to have to be ready for anything. With a weary sigh, Jake set off down the corridor, already mentally compiling a list of the supplies and equipment he would need. It was going to be a long, strange mating season on New Eden, that much was certain. But come what may, Jake Hansen would be ready. He was human after all. And if there was one thing humans were good at, it was adapting to survive, no matter the odds. The confrontation. Jake raced through the corridors of New Eden, his heart pounding in his ears. He'd managed to alert the colony's security forces to the situation in his apartment, but their response had been frustratingly slow and bureaucratic. By the time they'd assembled a proper hazmat team and containment unit, precious minutes had ticked by. Minutes in which the knocked-out Zephyr could wake up and resume their violent mating ritual at any moment. Jake couldn't take that chance. He had to confront Zoloff and the others to try and reason with them one last time. And if that failed, well, he'd just have to improvise. He arrived back at his apartment to find the door blown clean off its hinges, the metal twisted and scorched from the force of the Sci-Fi's entry. Taking a deep breath, Jake stepped inside, bracing himself for the worst. To his surprise, the apartment was empty, the unconscious bodies of the Sci-Fi nowhere to be seen. Jake's heart sank as he realized what must have happened. They'd woken up and given chase, likely following the scent. Jake's heart sank as he realized what must have happened. They'd woken up and given chase, likely following the scent of their chosen mate, him. He had to find them, and fast, before they could cause any more damage or harm to the unsuspecting residents of New Eden. But where would they have gone? Jake's mind raced, trying to put himself in the mindset of a desperate, instinct-driven alien. If he were a Sci-Fi, where would he go to claim his mate? Suddenly, it hit him. The environmental controls. In their iridescent eyes, he demonstrated his dominance and cunning by using the station's systems against them. They would see that as a sign of his worthiness, his desirability as a mate. And the central hub for New Eden's environmental systems was... Oh no, Jake breathed, his eyes widening in horror. The atrium. He took off at a dead run, praying he wouldn't be too late. The atrium was the heart of New Eden, a vast multi-level space that housed the colony's most vital systems: life support, power distribution, communications. It was also the most heavily populated area, with shops, restaurants, and public gathering spaces radiating out from the central plaza. If the Zephyr were to stage their final mating ritual there, in front of the entire colony, Jake shuddered at the thought, pushing himself to run faster. He burst into the atrium to find a scene of utter chaos. Screaming colonists ran in every direction as energy blasts scorched the air, shattering storefronts and sending debris flying. In the center of it all stood the Sci-Fi, their iridescent forms glowing with an almost feverish intensity. And before them, perched on the edge of the plaza's central fountain, was Zorax. The massive alien had one of his forearms wrapped around the throat of a terrified human woman, holding her aloft like a trophy. Jake Hansen. Zorax roared, his voice booming across the atrium. You have proven yourself a worthy mate, cunning and resourceful, but your final test remains. Face me in combat, here and now, or this one dies. Jake skidded to a halt, his heart hammering in his chest. Zorax was using an innocent bystander as a hostage, forcing his hand. He couldn't let the woman die, but he also couldn't give in to the Sci-Fi's twisted demands. He had to find another way. His eyes darted around the atrium, searching for anything he could use to his advantage. There, a control panel for the fountain, just a few meters away. If he could get to it. Well, human. Zorax snarled, tightening his grip on the hostage's throat. What is your answer? Jake met the alien's eyes, his jaw set with determination. I accept your challenge, Zorax, he called out. But we fight on my terms. Release her, and let's settle this, one-on-one. Zorax hesitated, then threw back his head and laughed. Very well, little mate, he growled. We fight on your terms. But know this, when I defeat you, you will submit to me, body and soul, for the rest of your days. With that, he hurled the gasping woman aside and leaped down from the fountain, his forearms spreading wide in a battle stance. Jake didn't hesitate. He charged forward, ducking and rolling under Zorax's grasping hands, and slammed his fist down on the fountain's control panel. Instantly, the plaza exploded with a geyser of pressurized water, catching Zorax full in the chest and sending him flying backwards. The other Zephyrs screeched in shock and outrage, but before they could react, Jake was among them, using the slick spray of the fountain to slide between their legs and deliver stunning blows to their sensitive spots. It was a risky, desperate move, but it bought him the seconds he needed. Zorax, sputtering and enraged, heaved himself back to his feet and charged, murder in his silver eyes. Jake met him head-on, ducking inside the range of those crushing arms to deliver a series of rapid, targeted strikes. He'd spent years studying xenobiology in his off time, fascinated by the diversity of life in the galaxy. Now that knowledge was the only thing keeping him alive, as he targeted the weak points in Zorax's alien anatomy. But Zorax was a seasoned warrior, and his rage gave him strength. He weathered Jake's blows and came on, his forearms battering and grasping, his iridescent skin slick with fountain spray. They traded attacks in a brutal, staccato dance, the atrium ringing with the sounds of their battle. Around them, the colonists watched in stunned silence, hardly daring to breathe. Jake felt his strength beginning to flag, his body battered and bruised from Zorax's relentless assault. He couldn't keep this up much longer. He needed to end this now. In a flash of desperate inspiration, he feinted left, drawing Zorax's arms out wide, then dove forward, tackling the alien around the waist. They crashed to the ground in a tangle of limbs, water spraying in all directions. Jake ended up on top, straddling Zorax's chest. The alien bucked and writhed beneath him, but Jake held on grimly, his hands locked around Zorax's throat. "Yield," he yelled, squeezing with all his might. "Yield, damn you." For a long, horrible moment, he thought Zorax would keep fighting, that he'd have to actually kill the alien to end this. But then something in those silver eyes shifted, and Zorax went limp, his forearms falling to his sides. "I yield," he gasped, his voice ragged. "The human is victorious." Jake held on a moment longer, hardly daring to believe it. Then, slowly, he released his grip and stood up, backing away from Zorax's prone form. Around him, the atrium erupted in cheers, the colonists surging forward to congratulate their unlikely champion. Jake barely heard them, his gaze fixed on Zoloth and the other Sci-Fi. The aliens stared back at him, their expressions unreadable. Then, as one, they bowed their heads, acknowledging his victory. "You have proven yourself, Jake Hansen," Zoloth said, her musical voice carrying across the sudden silence. "By the ancient laws of our people, we acknowledge you as the victor of the mating ritual. We will trouble you no more." Jake nodded, too exhausted to speak. He watched as the Sci-Fi gathered up Zorax's battered body and departed, their iridescent forms disappearing into the depths of the station. It was over. He'd won. But as the adrenaline faded and the pain of his injuries began to make itself known, Jake couldn't help but feel a twinge of regret. The Sci-Fi had been misguided, even violent, but at the heart of it all, they'd just been fighting for the survival of their species. Could he really blame them for that? Shaking his head, Jake turned away from the cheering crowd and limped off towards the infirmary. He had a feeling this wouldn't be the last he saw of the Sci-Fi. But for now, he just wanted a long, hot shower and a cold pack for his bruises. Being the galaxy's most eligible bachelor was exhausting work. With a wry grin, Jake reflected that at least his mating season was over. For now, anyway. One can never be too sure, out here on the galactic frontier. An unlikely alliance. Jake lay on a cot in the station's infirmary, wincing as the medical bot tended to his various cuts, bruises, and contusions. The fight with Zorax had left him battered and sore, but victorious, a small price to pay for getting the Zephyr to leave him and New Eden in peace. Or so he thought. The door to the infirmary swished open, and Jake looked up, expecting to see the concerned face of the station's doctor, or maybe one of his fellow maintenance workers coming to check on him. Instead, he found himself staring into the iridescent eyes of Zoloth. Jake sat up abruptly, ignoring the pain that lanced through his ribs. "What are you doing here?" he demanded, his voice tight with tension. "I thought you agreed to leave me alone." Zoloth held up her 4 hands in a placating gesture, her expression uncharacteristically subdued. "Peace, Jake Hansen," she said softly. "I come not to fight, but to talk." Jake eyed her warily, but nodded for her to continue. The medical bot, sensing the tension, discreetly withdrew to the far side of the room. Xyloth took a deep breath, her iridescent skin shimmering under the infirmary's bright lights. I wanted to apologize, she said, the words seeming to cost her some effort. For my actions and those of my kin. We were desperate, driven by our biology and the impending extinction of our species. But that does not excuse the harm we caused to you and your people. Jake stared at her, hardly believing what he was hearing. An apology from the alien who had started this whole crazy mess. It seemed too good to be true. I appreciate that, he said slowly, choosing his words with care. But I'm not sure it's enough. Your mating ritual nearly got a lot of innocent people hurt, myself included. Xyloth bowed her head, her posture genuinely contrite. I know, she said softly, and for that I am truly sorry. But Jake, there's more. She looked up, meeting his gaze with an intensity that made him catch his breath. My people are dying, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. This mating ritual, it was our last hope. Without new genetic material, without a compatible mate, we will not survive another generation. Jake felt a sudden, unexpected pang of sympathy. He'd already deduced that the Zephyr were facing some kind of existential crisis. Why else would they go to such desperate lengths to secure a mate? But to hear it laid out so plainly, so starkly, it cast their actions in a new light. I'm sorry, he said, and meant it. Truly, no species should have to face extinction. But Xyloth, I'm not the answer. I can't be. We're too different, you and I. Xyloth shook her head, a small, sad smile playing across her alien features. I know that now, she said. You proved that, in the atrium, you are strong, resourceful, a credit to your species. But you are not Zephyr. Our mating could never produce viable offspring. She paused, seeming to steel herself. But that does not mean you cannot help us. Jake frowned, a wary sensation prickling along his spine. What do you mean? He asked, half dreading the answer. Xyloth leaned forward, her silver eyes intense. My people need genetic diversity to survive, she said. And while you may not be a compatible mate, your species is. Jake's eyes widened as he realized what she was suggesting. You want to mate with other humans? He asked, his voice rising in disbelief. Xyloth held up a placating hand. Not like before, she assured him. Not by force or coercion. But if we could find willing human partners, those who understand our plight and wish to help, it could save the Zephyr from extinction. Jake rubbed his temples, feeling a headache coming on that had nothing to do with his injuries. What Xyloth was suggesting was, well, it was unprecedented. The idea of humans and aliens interbreeding, even willingly, would be a hard sell to the powers that be back on Earth. But at the same time, he couldn't deny the appeal of the idea. If it worked, it could be the start of a whole new era of interspecies cooperation, a true melding of human and alien biology and culture. And more selfishly, it would mean he was off the hook as the galaxy's most eligible bachelor. I can't promise anything, he said at last, meeting Xyloth's gaze. But I'm willing to try. To talk to my people, to see if there are any who would be willing to help. It's the least I can do after, well, everything. Xyloth's face lit up, her iridescent skin glowing with hope and gratitude. Thank you, Jake Hansen, she said, her musical voice thick with emotion. You may well have saved my species today, in more ways than one. She stood, bowing low in the Sci-Fi gesture of respect. I will await word from you and your people, she said, and in the meantime, I hope you will consider me a friend. With that, she turned and left, leaving Jake alone with his racing thoughts. A friend, an alien friend, one he'd fought tooth and nail just hours before. It was a strange concept. But then again, was it any stranger than anything else that had happened to him since this whole crazy mating season began? With a rueful chuckle, Jake lay back on the cot, his mind already whirling with plans and possibilities. It looked like his days as a simple maintenance worker were well and truly over. But then again, who wanted simple? He was Jake Hansen, interstellar matchmaker, forging a new era of human-alien relations, one mating ritual at a time. And honestly, he couldn't wait to see what the future held. A new understanding. Jake stood before the assembled leaders of New Eden, trying not to fidget under the weight of their collective gaze. He'd never been comfortable in the spotlight, preferring the simple, solitary life of a maintenance worker. But recent events had thrust him into a role he'd never asked for, but couldn't ignore. And that's the situation, he concluded, his voice echoing in the cavernous council chamber. The Sci-Fi need our help. Without an influx of new genetic material, they face extinction within a generation. And while their methods were misguided, I believe their cause is a worthy one that we, as fellow sentient beings, have a moral obligation to aid. A murmur ran through the gathered counselors, their expressions ranging from thoughtful to skeptical to outright hostile. Jake knew he was asking a lot. The idea of humans voluntarily mating with aliens was one that would take some getting used to say the least. But to his surprise, it was the station's commander, a grizzled veteran named Hawkins, who spoke up first. "Mr. Hansen," he said, his voice gruff but not unkind. "While I appreciate your unique perspective on this matter, surely you understand the position this puts us in. The Sci-Fi attacked our station, threatened our people. Many would say they forfeited any right to our aid." Jake nodded, having expected this argument. "I understand, Commander," he said respectfully. "And I'm not suggesting we forget what happened or absolve the Sci-Fi of responsibility. But I ask you to consider, if we were facing extinction, if our very survival depended on the goodwill of an alien race, wouldn't we hope for their understanding, their compassion?" Hawkins frowned, but Jake could see he'd struck a chord. The commander was a hard-ass, but he wasn't heartless. "And there's more," Jake continued, pressing his advantage. "Think of the potential benefits of an alliance with the Sci-Fi. Their technology, their knowledge, it could advance our own development by centuries, and a cooperative breeding program could lead to advances in medicine, in genetics, in our very understanding of life itself." He paused, letting his words sink in. But more than that, it could be the start of something greater. A new era of interspecies cooperation, of true mutual understanding. Imagine what we could achieve, working together instead of fighting each other. There was a long, pregnant pause. Then, slowly, Hawkins nodded. "Damn it, Hansen," he growled. "I hate to admit it, but you make a compelling case. I'll put it to a vote." Jake held his breath as hands were raised, first a few, then more, until finally, "The motion passes," Hawkins declared, sounding almost surprised. "New Eden will extend an offer of assistance to the Sci-Fi on the condition of strict guidelines and oversight of any cooperative breeding programs." Jake let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. His heart swelling with a mixture of relief, pride, and trepidation. He'd done it. He'd actually convinced the council to give the Sci-Fi a chance. Now the real work could begin. The next few weeks passed in a blur of activity as the details of the Human Sci-Fi Alliance were hammered out. Teams of scientists and diplomats shuttled back and forth between New Eden and the Sci-Fi mothership, working out the specifics of the proposed breeding program. Jake found himself at the center of it all, serving as an unofficial liaison between the two species. His unique experience with the Sci-Fi and his role in brokering the alliance had made him a respected figure on both sides of the negotiations. It was strange, being the focus of so much attention after years of living in obscurity. But as he watched the first volunteers, brave, pioneering men and women from both species, step forward to begin the program, he knew it was all worth it. Months passed, then years. The breeding program, while not without its challenges and setbacks, began to bear fruit. The first hybrid children were born, beautiful and unique, embodying the best of both human and Sci-Fi traits. And with each new generation, the bonds between the two species grew stronger. What had begun as a desperate plea for survival had blossomed into a true partnership, a melding of cultures and peoples that enriched them both. Jake watched it all with a sense of quiet pride and wonder. He'd never set out to be a hero, never aspired to change the course of history. But through a strange quirk of fate and a healthy dose of human stubbornness, he'd done just that. And as he looked out over the thriving, vibrant community that New Eden had become, he knew he wouldn't have it any other way. One evening, as he sat in his quarters looking over reports from the latest batch of hybrid births, his door chimed. Wondering who would be visiting at this late hour, he called out, "Come in." To his surprise, it was Xyloth who entered, her iridescent skin glowing softly in the dim light. Jake realized with a start that he hadn't seen her in person in months, not since the early days of the negotiations. "Hello, Jake," she said softly, her musical voice as entrancing as ever. "I hope I'm not disturbing you." Jake shook his head, gesturing for her to take a seat. "Not at all," he assured her. "It's good to see you, Xyloth. How have you been?" She smiled, a gentle, almost wistful expression. "Well," she said, "very well, in fact. Thanks in no small part to you." Jake waved off the praise, feeling a faint flush rise to his cheeks. "I was just doing what anyone would have done," he demurred. "You and your people needed help. I'm just glad I was in a position to provide it." Xyloth shook her head, her silver eyes serious. "Don't underplay your role, Jake," she chided gently. "What you did, it was remarkable. You saved my species. You brought our peoples together. You changed everything." She stood, moving to stand by the large window that dominated one wall of Jake's quarters. Beyond, the stars glittered in the endless black, the swirling hues of distant nebulae painting the void in shades of purple and gold. "I came to say thank you," Xyloth said softly, not turning from the view, "and goodbye." Jake stood, moving to join her by the window. "Goodbye," he echoed, a sudden tightness in his throat. "Where are you going?" She turned to face him, and he was struck anew by her alien beauty, by the depths of wisdom and sorrow in her eyes. "Home," she said simply. "To the Sci-Fi worlds. There is still much work to be done, to rebuild our society, to integrate the lessons and gifts your people have given us. I am needed there." Jake nodded slowly, understanding, even as a part of him wanted to protest, to beg her to stay. "I'll miss you," he said instead, the words feeling wholly inadequate. Xyloth smiled, reaching out to take his hand in hers. Her skin was cool and smooth, her touch electric. "And you, Jake Hansen," she murmured. "More than you can know. But this isn't goodbye forever. We'll see each other again, in this life or the next." She leaned in then, pressing her lips to his in a kiss that was at once alien and achingly familiar. Jake closed his eyes, losing himself in the sensation, in the bittersweet knowledge that this moment, like so many others, would soon be just a memory. When they parted, Xyloth's eyes were shining with unshed tears. "Be well, my friend," she whispered. "And remember, you'll always have a place among the stars." With that, she was gone, the door whispering shut behind her. Jake stood there for a long time afterward, staring out at the infinite expanse of space, his heart full of a strange mix of sadness and hope. Xyloth was right, he knew. This wasn't an ending, but a beginning. The start of a new chapter in the story of their two peoples, a story that would echo down through the generations. And as he stood there, the starlight washing over him, Jake couldn't help but smile. Whatever the future held, he knew one thing for certain: it was going to be one hell of a ride, and he wouldn't have missed it for the world.